The Jewish year ended much as it began, with an unprecedented attack on Israel intended to cause maximum casualties. But after 1 year of war, Israel was prepared. This is in no way a regular Rosh Hashanah Eve. We will talk about everything that has been happening, and we will also bring you some strength and resilience with two conversations that will bring a smile to your face. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's unholy, two Jews on the news. Should we admit the truth, which is you and I had already prepared, recorded, it was in the can, a special episode for Rosh Hashanah when the phones started going late afternoon, early evening Israel time, with these alerts, with these messages, sending the whole population really into their shelters, their safe rooms, as Israel came under Iranian attack. I mean, so, you know, Yoni, you lived through it. We were communicating as it was happening. You were broadcasting to the nation as it was happening. Just, I mean, talk us through it.
I mean, look, I've been in the news business for 2 decades, so I know how to sum things up in headlines. Let's say this. First of all, the good news is that Israel's aerial defense capabilities withstood this unprecedented attack, that Israel's allies stepped up yet again, and that the Israeli public was very, very careful and listened to the home front command. The bad news is that Iran had the ability and dexterity and audacity to attack Israel directly with more than 180 missiles. So I think that is what we should talk about. And you talked about, you know, how this was unfolding. I would want to kind of, you know, explain and talk about how that felt, but you have to kind of compare it to what happened in April, the first Iranian attack, to understand the difference. And I remind you then, hundreds of projectiles were launched towards Israel, but it was drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles. And remember, we were talking about this on the podcast right after, where the IDF spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, kind of said to the nation at 11 p.m. on a Saturday, there are drones on their way to Israel from Iran. It will take a few hours. And then you had that weird waiting period in which you kind of waited. This time, it was a much narrower window because the Iranians were taking notes too, and it was ballistic missiles launched over Israel. So the minute that happens, you have 12 minutes and not hours. But this was building up throughout the day. Around 2 p.m., the IDF Home Front Command kind of had new restrictions, saying people can't gather in large numbers in the central part of Israel. Then around 4 o'clock, the news actually broke from the United States saying an Iranian attack on Israel is imminent. And then, you sit in the news desk, Jonathan, you know this, there are so many huge television screens. They're all tuned into different channels, but all of them have the chyron saying an Iranian attack on Israel is imminent. And even if you're a completely level-headed person and very calm, you have that moment where you breathe in. And the silly maybe I can share the silly thought I had in my head with you, is that if someone had told me on October 1st, 2023, that a year after the chyron on Israeli television on October 1st, 2024 would be an Iranian attack on Israel is imminent, I would first of all tell that person that they are crazy, and secondly say, if this is true, something must have gone horribly, horribly wrong. And obviously something did. So the tension was growing, and around, I think, 6:30 p.m., it was very clear that it is happening soon. 7:30, the sirens went on all over Israel, including the central part of Israel and the southern part of Israel, which means also the television studios that I work in, and people had to go into a protected area for a few minutes, meaning someone else had to broadcast the news on those sort of critical moments. And then it happened. And of course, what we saw this time, and as I mentioned it, now it was just ballistic missiles. Most of them were intercepted, but the shrapnel of this amount, because it was obviously Iran this time trying to overwhelm the aerial defense capabilities, the amount left a lot of damage. Miraculously, and thanks to technology, no one was killed in this massive barrage. But of course, the meaning of it is that now the question is how Israel responds to this, and are we on a fast track to an all-out war with Iran?
Yeah, and when you say thanks to technology, and of course Israel's allies, the Americans very involved in Iron Dome, the system that brings down these missiles, explodes them, takes them out in the air. The Britain's own Royal Air Force was involved too. That announcement came very late last night, and the explanation from the British government was British forces were involved in preventing escalation. In other words, that the idea was by thwarting and blunting this Iranian attack, the hope is that prevents the slide to all-out regional war. I'm not sure many people are confident that that can be avoided. Some interesting questions in my mind about whether or not Israel's allies, both tacit and overt, in the region, how involved they were. We know that Jordan was involved again this time, just like they were in April, showing the worth of that peace agreement, which is 30 years old this year. There will last time in April, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, they were involved, sketching out the kind of alliance, the anti-Iranian alliance that exists there for Israel to take a full part in. Should it make next diplomatic moves? But of course, all attention, I think, inevitably goes to what happens next and what the next move is. And Prime Minister Netanyahu said beforehand, as clearly as he could when he was at the UN, I think, he said, if you hit us, we will hit you. We can hit you wherever you are. We can go as far as we need to go, and we will do that. And this is an attack, and therefore there will be a response. The fact that people didn't die, I don't think enters into the Israeli calculation, because the intention was that they would. And therefore this will be retaliated for. And so that's a big question. In my mind, I think the big change is that some of those things that for the most of the last year, and you're absolutely right to just remind ourselves how extraordinary it is that we've got here in just 12 months. But there have been restraints on Israeli decision-making this last year. And one of them was Hezbollah's much vaunted power to hit Israel back. That was, in a way, the big deterrent that Iran had. You hit us, we can do anything against us. We've got this loaded gun right next to you there in the form of Hezbollah. That deterrent power is much reduced now because the military capacity has been so degraded. Hassan Nasrallah taken out, eliminated, and so, along with a whole of layers of command. So that's much less of a restraint. And then I would just say the political international one, there's less of a restraint, because for the whole of the last year, you've had Joe Biden there sort of almost pulling on the leash of Israel, saying, no, wait, hold on, you cannot go as far as you might want to. Does that power diminish when we are around a month away from a presidential election, and the knowledge in Netanyahu's mind that if drawing America in and escalating this war hurts Democrats' re-election chances, or Kamala Harris's re-election chances, that doesn't bother him so much. That's not really much of a constraint, seeing as he would probably prefer Donald Trump to win. So I just think the various things that have held us back until now have gone. And therefore, my question, in a way, would be what comes next, what people imagine will come next. I know that a lot of people around the Prime Minister are thinking, go all the way. There's talk of regime change, hit nuclear facilities, take out this Iranian regime that has threatened Israel for 40 years. I don't know if that's the appetite.
If only it was that simple.
Yeah.
If only it was that. Listen, there's a lot to say and to unpack in what you said. First of all, I think it's important to note that the masks are off, right? I mean, Iran has been attacking Israel in all sorts of ways, but never directly. It was usually using Hezbollah and other proxies, but only in April was the first time in which it did it directly. This is the second time. I remember one of our aerial defense experts, Tzvika Chaimovich, who said to me after the first time, he said the important thing that happened in the Iranian eyes, they crossed the Rubicon. They did it once. It's much, much easier to do it again, but you don't have the cover, on the other hand, of the fact that it's not us, it's not Iran, it's someone else. That is off. And of course, I don't think there's a consensus in the political arena in Israel that Israel will have to respond. The question is how. You mentioned Hezbollah, and I think that is very important. I want to go into, what happened in the past 2 weeks to understand how Israel hurt Hezbollah's capabilities. Before saying that, I just need to add something that happened yesterday was very, very important, was a terror attack in Jaffa, which is, part of the Tel Aviv municipality. 7 Israelis were murdered by 2 Palestinians with a semi-automatic weapon who came from Hebron. This was, a proof of the fact, or another illustration of the fact, rather, that we can have high-tech and technology to protect us in the skies, and it did protect us. But at the end of the day, it's the low-tech terror that hit us in the gut yesterday. And in that sense, this was the worst terror attack on Israel since October 7th. And it was the worst terror attack in the Tel Aviv area since the Second Intifada. So that kept being the sort of cloud over what happened yesterday, besides the Iranian story that is important to talk about. Let's go back to Hezbollah, maybe, and say what happened in the past 2 weeks that forced Iran, from its perspective, to respond, which is Israel essentially taking down the capabilities of the largest terrorist army in the world that was threatening it for decades, right? I mean, first we saw the pager attack, then we saw the assassinations against top brass in the Hezbollah, then Nasrallah himself. We will send our listeners to listen to that episode we recorded with Shimrit Meir only a few days ago. It seems like, a year ago. And another important thing, Israel launching a ground incursion against Hezbollah in Lebanon for the first time in 18 years, discovering, only from those couple of days, tunnels and ammunition that were all intended to actually perpetrate the same thing that we saw on October 7th on a larger scale. This will obviously also complicate things because Israel is now with a few open fronts, Gaza and Lebanon and Iran. This is where we are.
But I think some people will find that phenomenon you're describing of the mask coming off as kind of clarifying, in a way, that at last, after decades of being encircled in this ring of fire, with Iran's proxies, the 3 H's, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. And now, actually, that, as you said, the mask is off. Now we're actually into all-out confrontation. It's that feeling that there's been clouds rumbling for ages, and now the storm is broken. And therefore, there is this desire to say, let's deal with this once and for all. That sentiment, once it's there and takes hold, automatically leads you to escalation. And there is, I'm sure, a kind of desire to go all the way, partly heartened by those phenomenal successes militarily. I mean, we're talking about the pager attack, Nasrallah, again, you and I have gone over this, but just the point about the sheer technical prowess, regardless of the view you take on the rights and wrongs of it, just on that level, I'm wondering whether you're detecting, first of all, I mean, there's on public opinion is one thing, but actually in the circle around the Prime Minister, maybe in the military brass, a desire to say, gloves off. And now to mix the metaphor, we've had all the tentacles that we've been dealing with one by one for years. Now let's go, chop off the head, which sits in Tehran. And that's, I notice commentators and others talking about regime change, and I can understand why that appetite is there, since Iran has been directing these, orchestrating, designing this ring of fire around Israel. Because if that is the desire, this is a much more serious business, and it will mean advancing and going ever further, so that the incursion into Lebanon will be the absolute least of it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, sure, there are voices around the Prime Minister. We should say that, as you said, the enemies of Israel sent by Iran have built and amassed this unbelievable power around it. And first of all, it is important that we are at a point in time where Israel needs to deal with that with the help of its allies, led by the United States. But it is also a question, how do you deal with the big evil, which is Iran, and how do you do that? Israel can't do that alone. With all of our technological prowess and our abilities that have been proven, still, we can't do it alone. So the question is how much the United States, 5 weeks before an election, would want to go into this, and how much Israel itself can, withstand this kind of attack. Because at the end of the day, look at our lives. A few years ago, it was a flare-up with Hamas every couple of years. Now it's a flare-up with Iran every couple of months. If this becomes something that happens regularly, Israel, will have a hard time sustaining this morally, socially, economically. So these are really large questions. On the other hand, yes, you need to send this message, maybe clearly to Iran, saying, back off. So we are at a very precarious point, for sure. These are really, really dramatic days.
They are. I mean, the question about timing.
That was more. I was answering your questions with questions. Did
you were. No, it's a Jewish thing. It's a Jewish thing, and that's wholly, it goes with the grain. I mean, just on the timing is a big question. Whether, the Iranians obviously felt that they had to respond to the killing of Hassan Nasrallah quickly. In the conversation you and I had recorded, which people are not hearing because it was overtaken by events, I said there that I thought that the loss of face for Iran of losing Nasrallah, then who is not, I think some people might not realize this, he's not just a sort of Lebanese ally. He was absolutely integrated into the Iranian ruling circle. Apparently, by all accounts, was a really trusted close advisor of the supreme leader himself on all matters relating to Israel and that conflict. We know in the pager attack that one of the pagers was carried by the Iranian ambassador to Beirut. These things were absolutely enmeshed. So it was a huge loss of face to lose one of their own guys, coming not that long after they'd lost Ismail Haniyeh, allowed him to be killed, a Hamas leader, under their noses, right there in Tehran. The point was, they had often all said, when the General Soleimani was killed in the Trump administration period, they said, we will respond at a time and place of our choosing, which could be months or even years later. This time, I clearly concluded the loss of face was so great, there was no time to waste. If they were not going to lose standing in the region, they had to respond very, very quickly, days later. My question, in a way, not necessarily to you, but just sort of I'm airing it, is what does Israel feel about that in terms of timing? Does it feel an attack like the one that was witnessed on Tuesday night has to be responded to, eventually, within weeks, within days, within hours? How does that work in terms of, the necessary sending of a signal? Does Israel feel it has to respond immediately? And in a way, I'm asking for a friend. I'm asking for Joe Biden, because I think Joe Biden will be thinking, okay, we get you're going to have to respond, but could it be after November the 5th, please, or November the 6th? Asking for Kamala Harris as well as Joe Biden. Because in a way, if it's now, that really massively complicates it. This is the October surprise people feared was a Middle East war that somehow, discredits or drags down the incumbent administration, including Kamala Harris. So timing, I think, is all, even as I absolutely do not doubt Israel will have to respond and respond severely.
I think, on the other hand, I mean, as you say, perhaps the American administration would want it to be later. I actually think that Israeli decision makers would think about the fact that this is a window. And by the way, not only until the 5th of November, but actually until the 20th of January, where there's actually a different president in the White House. That is a window in which to respond. One more note on Nasrallah himself, right? Just to say, this is a man who I realize that some of the international media has been tripping over itself to describe him as a responsible adult and a social leader. This is a butcher who helped kill not only Americans and Europeans, but also Arabs in Syria. He was, the right-hand man for Bashar al-Assad in his butchering of his people. But also the interesting thing about this, and again, the news is happening so fast that we don't even have time to mull over this, but the fact that this is a man who thought he knew Israeli society so well and didn't see it coming. Like, he didn't realize that the structure of the attack against Hezbollah and severely hurting Hezbollah is something that will eventually hit him. As you say, from the Iranian perspective, they had to respond to this. And from the Israeli perspective, they will have to respond to this attack, really unprecedented in numbers of ballistic missiles, a direct attack on Israel, this is going to happen. Not to give any information or pretend that I have any, I don't think that Israel will wait until November 6th to answer your question on that.
Yeah, no, I sort of assumed that, and I think that will be one reason why this is, what the White House and particularly the Kamala Harris campaign least wanted. This imposes strains on their domestic electoral coalition that she, particularly Kamala Harris, had managed to quiet. That we've talked before about the Arab American vote in Michigan. This all goes back into play again and becomes very difficult. Obviously not the main thing. Just want to absolutely echo and stand with your observation about Hassan Nasrallah and his lethal role in the slaughter of north of 700,000 people in Syria. He was a lieutenant. Some say, for his own strategic reasons, he was reluctantly drawn in. I don't care about that. The point is he was at Assad's side in those terrible campaign of mass slaughter for which there has been no accountability. Hezbollah was deployed as Iran's proxy in that Syrian civil war on Assad's side. That's really important. In terms of the point about him miscalculating, I find that so interesting because obviously he was, even Israelis admit that he really did, was a student of Israel and sort of a scholar of what happened in Israel. My guess is that he didn't underestimate Israel's technical ability. He would have known that Israel had the power to get him and to flatten the apartment buildings under which he and the Hezbollah high command were gathering. I think he'd have known that. He probably calculated that they wouldn't dare do it because it would be such a massive escalation. And I think that was his miscalculation. He underestimated the extent to which Israel feels look, we've had it for too long, being encircled by these proxies, by being under fire from Hezbollah, and we're going to do whatever it takes. And in a way, part of that, I'm sure, is the sense, it's just how I see it, that in terms of offending world opinion, that ship has sailed. Israel is already on the wrong side of a lot of world opinion. It's not going to get any bouquets from the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice in The Hague. We might as well, do the job that's required here. And one of those jobs is to eliminate the leader of Hezbollah, which has had its weapons trained on Israel, not just trained, but firing on Israel for a whole year.
Yeah, and violation of an agreement that ended the Second Lebanon War. And when you see what now that there are ground forces inside, Israeli ground forces in Lebanon, you see what Hezbollah was actually planning for the northern side of Israel. And I think that's important to, say again, this is the plan. They planned something on a larger scale of October 7th. It's clear from the tunnels you see and the ammunition that they found. So this is an organization that was planning a mass murder on Israelis. And as you said, again, Nasrallah himself was someone who was busy not only planning to kill Jews and killing Jews, but also Arabs around the region and others. This has been the darkest Jewish year in 8 decades. And, I think back to those times when the biggest argument, a disagreement between you and me, was about presents for Rosh Hashanah. You remember that? When we started this
Still
podcast.
An abomination, but very happy to relitigate that. But no, you're right. That used to be our idea of a disagreement.
It was, because I told you that I kept sending you pictures on Rosh Hashanah of the presents I, prepared for family and friends, and you were appalled by this, and you said that in diaspora it's not a moment of giving gifts, that the moment is actually Hanukkah, and we would argue about this every year. So I kind of missed that. But also, yesterday I was looking at the pile of gifts I'd prepared and thinking whether to send it to you or not, and the thought that went through my head was, the only thing I want for the new year is a new year. I mean, just a new year. And we have talked about so many things on this episode, about Iran and about Lebanon and about the northern front and about a terror attack in Jaffa. But there are 101 hostages held by Hamas in Gaza. The only thing that has a time limit is their life. The rest, we can deal with everything, and we have a lot to deal with. But this is very, very urgent. And from all of the things that I've been watching in the past couple of weeks, I think the most painful thing was to see, we aired a project about the hostages and their videos and pictures from their last Rosh Hashanah exactly a year ago. And that is this, it is so painful just to see. There's no a horror in that. It's just to see the lives of these people, and that the fact that they don't know that in a mere few weeks that those lives would be turned upside down. And it kind of reminded me of that wonderful book by Amos Elon, The Pity of It All, about the Jewish German communities before the Holocaust. That was this, I think, a very painful moment.
I had a very similar response to a very powerful documentary film that is going to be aired here, made by Channel 4, called One Day in October. And the whole film is speaking to survivors of October 7th in Kibbutz Be'eri. And the interviews with them are all, it's a really tough but very moving account of what happened. But funnily enough, and we hadn't sort of, pre-discussed this, it had the same thing actually leapt out at me, which was that there are just a few moments, few photographs, bit of footage of the people who they interview before October 7th. So, for example, they do speak to the father and daughter, Tom Hand and Emily Hand, who Emily, then aged 8, was a hostage, and extraordinarily she is interviewed in this film. It's very unusual to see an interview with a young child about that night. But there is a photograph just before of the sleepover that she was having with her friend that was then obviously interrupted by October 7th. But just that picture of her two children a few hours before, that absolutely gets at you. Got at me the same way. And there just are a few images of the kibbutz beforehand. And anyone who's visited a kibbutz, you just know the layout and the geography. It's now very poignant to see that, the world that was before it was all shattered. So I'm very much with you on that, and your point that with all the geopolitics and everything else we've talked about, the thing I think will hit people very deeply in synagogues all around the world as people gather tonight as Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, begins, and going into the next couple of days when people will gather, will be the hostages. I've said before that pretty well every diaspora community that I know of has a prayer for the hostages. The Jewish world being what it is, everybody in every synagogue will have a cousin, a friend, a family link to a hostage family. So this is not abstract. And their plight, and the notion that they are going into another year of this, when it first happened, people thought maybe weeks, months. Another year of this is just very, very hard to bear as we go into the Jewish New Year celebration, which is what it's meant to be.
It is meant to be a celebration, and in that vein, we thought it would be a good idea to bring you two conversations that we recorded this week, obviously before the Iranian attack, but that we wanted to bring in some strength and resilience and light. And we hope that has succeeded.
Rabbi Angela Buchdahl is, according to Newsweek, one of America's 50 most influential rabbis. She is the senior rabbi and senior cantor. Regular listeners of Unholy know that about you, the cantor. We've got that down. Of Central Synagogue in New York City, and is the first woman to lead Central Reform's congregation in its 180-year history. Born in Korea to a Jewish American father and a Korean Buddhist mother, Rabbi Buchdahl is the first Asian American to be ordained as a cantor or rabbi in North America. Rabbi Angela, it is very good to have you back with us on Unholy. You left a lasting mark last time as we went into No, you really did. People, and you know what it's going to be. It's about the singing. It's the message you convey, but you're breaking into song. People told me they played it back multiple times as a kind of solace and consolation in this very troubled year. So that brings it. I mean, really, the opening question is: we are about to go into Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Normally, we use the word celebration about that festival. How can we celebrate this year? Is it even appropriate to use the language of celebration this year?
Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm honored to be back, and I continue to listen to both of you for my way of understanding what's really going on in Israel, and so I thank you for that. I can't believe also that it's many months later and we are still here as we near this 1 year mark. And this question of do we celebrate? How do we celebrate? I guess it's not a new question. In many ways, this is the question we've been asking ourselves since October 7th. I think about Itai Chen's family. He was taken into captivity and they had their youngest son's bar mitzvah the next week. Do we celebrate? I think about Doron Peretz's family. They had one son, he was shot, and another one in captivity, and he had a wedding. And they had to decide, do we go forward with this wedding? Can we possibly celebrate? And I personally was officiating a very big wedding in Mexico City the Shabbat, after October 7th. And the family came to me and said, can we still do this wedding? And my response was, we absolutely must go forward with this wedding. And, there's a story from the Talmud, which I found was illustrative. When you have a funeral procession and it bumps into a wedding procession, it's actually, they're commanded, the mourners, to take a few steps away from their mourning and actually celebrate with the bride and groom and then go back. And I find that sense that actually Jews, even in the face of death, will continue to choose life. And life affirming things like love and family and community. That's what we do. And I think we know that what Hamas wanted to do was not just murder Jews. On October 7th, the barbarity, the scale, the brutality, the degradation, they wanted to demoralize and break our spirit. And I think the act of choosing to celebrate is a form of spiritual resilience and resistance. And so, yes, I never understood better until October 7th how our tradition says, I've set before you life and death, choose life. I always thought, well, of course you choose life. That's so obvious. And then I thought about what it's like when death is right before you and you think, how do I possibly choose life? And yet that is what Jews do. And that is what Itai Chen's family did. It's what the Peretz family did. It's what my wedding couple did. It's what Israelis have been doing all year as babies continue to be born, as weddings happen, as people are finding ways. Now, all of these celebrations are different. They're not the same. They are heavier. And yet there's also this deep connection between sorrow and unbearable pain and exquisite technicolor aliveness of recognizing what is most true and important, and it kind of is clarifying going through this. And so I think that our celebrations are obviously very different. And I guess I'll bring us one last teaching about celebration, because after we get through these holidays, which are generally heavier, the days of awe going into Yom Kippur, we get to Sukkot, our Thanksgiving holiday, Zman Simchatenu, where we are literally supposed to feel Ach Sameach, only joy. And I've always wondered, how do you command anyone to feel joy? And imagine our ancestors way back. They had years where their harvest was terrible, and they got to Sukkot and they said, I've had a drought. How am I supposed to be joyful? I don't know what my year is going to be. How can I have faith in this? The commandment is not to feel joy, it is to rejoice, which means to do the actions that bring joy. So even for those of us who are not feeling it, there's a way that we can rejoice and celebrate. And we're going to have to do that again with this new year.
Everything that you say really resonates with me, but I do want to, I don't know if this is making it harder, but just to sort of, we all know this has been the most difficult Hebrew year in Israeli history. And it is the first Chagim that it feels like it's not really Chagim, but it's all going to be Memorial Days, because the actual October 7th falls between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Simchat Torah, the end of Sukkot, is going to be yet another Jewish Memorial Day, because that will be exactly a year after Simchat Torah.
Right.
I almost want to ask your guidance on this. Are we supposed to have like half a heart that is sad and half that is happy? How do we actually do this, even on the technical, emotional level?
Well, I'll give you a little preview that my Erev Rosh Hashanah sermon for Rosh Hashanah is on grief. So my heart is there. I think that we actually have to be able to hold that grief with us. And we are, for the first time, I think, as a Jewish community, really truly experiencing a kind of communal grief that we haven't experienced in the same way before. Obviously, at all times, there are some people who are much more deeply in it. This is an experience in which we can actually experience a commons of the soul with each other, because we are going through something together. So there is maybe one of the only antidotes, and we never get over the grief. We just become companions with the grief. One of the antidotes is not feeling alone in it. And so I think that there's an opportunity for us as we gather, I hope, in our communities, with our families, over these Chagim, that we can actually connect to something much deeper with each other than we've ever experienced before, because we are grieving together. And so that is, I guess, the first piece, is we have to acknowledge that. And I actually think that Israelis are much better understanding grief than Americans are. We're a death-denying culture over here. But I would say that we're also going to change the way we think about how we do these holidays. One of the things I'm very struck by when I look at the liturgy, which I'm looking at with fresh eyes, is a lot of our liturgy was clearly written in times of crisis and pain. And you cannot look at Unetana Tokef right now and not think about what they must have gone through when they wrote that liturgy, Who by Fire. And this year, it's not just Who by Fire. We're going to say, who by execution, who on a field, who in their pajamas, who in a safe room. I think that liturgy will resonate completely differently for us this year. And Eila Ezkara, the martyrology we do on a Yom Kippur afternoon, that was written at a certain time when that was so present. And for most of us, that felt like ancient history. This year, martyrs who died just because they're Jews, that is our reality right now. And we have at least 1,200 more martyrs of our people this year. And so at Central this year, we're actually featuring one of the hostages who was murdered, and we had a particular connection with his family over this last year, and we were devastated and grieving with them when they found out that he was dead. And I think that sense that this liturgy is alive, it's different for us this year when we come to it. And so I think one of the things we might find some comfort in is recognizing not only are we not alone, but Jews have been through this before. We have been here and we've come out on the other side. I think we sometimes forget that because it feels like right now no one has ever experienced this the way we have. But actually, I think I take some comfort in knowing we have, and we've come out on the other side.
So much in what you say there. I'm just thinking about your observation about the connection with hostage families in your own congregation, and how many diaspora congregations do have these direct links to the hostage crisis, to the hostage families. I think of my own community, we have the daughter of a hostage in our community, the grandchild of that hostage being readying for a bar mitzvah. So, and there will be congregations all over the Jewish world like that. When you explain to non-Jews, when one explains to non-Jews that, it's the Jewish New Year is coming up now, so I'm not going to be at work, they often assume it's fireworks, champagne at midnight, Old Lang Syne. And you have to explain, no, the Jewish New Year is not really like that. It's very, very different. In fact, and maybe this is very Jewish, it is, yes, it's a celebration, like we've been saying, but it's also the beginning of this period of deep reflection, the 10 days of penitence. We talk about the days of awe. But I just want to pick up on this penitence theme, which begins at Rosh Hashanah, the 10 days, all the way through to the climax of Yom Kippur. and atonement, and to ask you about that this year. And I'm just wondering whether in your congregation, are there Jews who resist the idea that they have anything, and we, the Jews, have anything to atone for? Do they feel that that this year of all years, Jews have been sinned against rather than sinning? Or do people feel that, yes, even in this year that began with this day of intense suffering, that we Jews have things to atone for? So atonement is in the air now, and I'm asking how we should come at that, how you think people are coming at that.
I mean, we are human beings, so we will always have something to atone for. And I mean, as a people, I think that, of course, even when we have been truly victimized and hurt and brutalized in a way that is beyond belief, there are still sins of our hearts. I think for many of us this year, in part because of our deep pain, we had almost an inability to cry for the losses on the other side. So we cannot harden our hearts in that way either. And I think for the sin of looking away, for the sin of casting off our own family members with whom we disagreed, we have plenty of things. And I think it's very telling that when we do our litany of sins over these holidays, we never say them in the individual, we say them in the collective. And so there is some sense that we as a community are doing this together. And so I might not have done this sin, but I know that someone in my community I care about has, and we are doing this together. And I think that's deeply important. I mean, I cannot erase the feeling of hearing hostage parents screaming across the border to Gaza, I am sorry, we haven't done enough. Hearing Rachel Goldberg Poland saying, we're sorry. And of course, like in one sense, they have nothing to be sorry for. They've done absolutely everything humanly possible for their children, and yet it wasn't enough. And sorry is not always because we've done something wrong, but we can still be deeply, deeply sorry for what this year has been. And that includes the tragedies that are happening in Gaza as well. We are sorry, even if it is an inevitable, tragic consequence of a horrible war, we can be sorry for that. So I think that there is a lot for which we need to pound our chest this year and I think of that pounding of our chest is to keep our heart from hardening, in part because we have been so wrong that somehow we might feel we are above needing to atone for anything.
You mentioned Rachel Goldberg Poland, and we had her on the podcast in December. And one of the things she said that resonates with me, she talked about how she says psalms in during the day, and she said, I do the ones where King David was angry. When he was saying to God, how long are you going to make me suffer? How long is this despair going to go on?
Right.
And it is, this might be a silly question. Is it okay to be angry this year at God? Is it okay? I'm sorry if that sounds completely ridiculous.
No, it's not. I am so grateful that our tradition gives us not only permission, but language for raging against God. I mean, really, we can be enraged. We can say, you've left me in the depths. Why are you hiding your face from me? You've abandoned me. There is real grievance that we have language for. And I think one of the most important things we need to remember, and this is not just about our relationship with God, but it also might be about our relationship with some of our family members that have become more strained in these days, or with members of our larger Jewish community who can't speak to each other right now, maybe particularly about Israel. Remember that when you feel anger, you are still in relationship. You feel anger because you actually have an emotional attachment in some way. I think actually when you are screaming, and the more you care and love someone, in some ways, the more angry you get. If you have absolute apathy, you can walk away. You can give the silent treatment. In many ways, then that relationship is completely severed. And I actually think that it is extremely healthy and important. If I was Rachel, and I felt this as well, but especially if I was Rachel, I would be furious at God all year. And she And she had the language for that and the permission, but that meant she was still in relationship. So remarkably, when she gave her eulogy after she knew 11 months of captivity and brutality, and then her son is terribly executed right before being rescued. I mean, she began with gratitude to God. I tell you, she takes my breath away, like every time I hear her. But she could start with gratitude because she was still in that relationship. And once that chapter of the saga was over, she could still say, thank you, God, for giving me this child. Thank you for making me his mother. I just found that unbelievable. So, yes. And I think if she hadn't been able to be angry, if she'd said, God is dead, I'm done, then that relationship's completely over. But it wasn't. And so I actually hope that each of us will get angry when we have the reasons to be angry and to express that anger. And that will help us stay in it with each other. That will keep the relationship alive.
It's like those people who say the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference.
Right.
And
Exactly.
and you get to
Exactly.
that. I mean, that eulogy of Rachel Goldberg-Pollen, it's such a well-known story, but it does remind me of it, the famous, almost mythic story of Jews in Auschwitz, putting God on trial,
Mm.
finding him guilty, and then going
Hmm.
to say the mincha prayers for the evening
Right.
service, afternoon service, because even if you believe God has let you down terribly, you are still, as you say, in relationship with that being. I wanted to just pull back a bit from this period right now and talk running up to the big festivals and talking about how the year has been. One thing we've done a lot on the podcast, I mean, in a way, all the time, is to talk about what this has been like to go through this for Israelis, and there are opinion polls every week about do they support or oppose and this, that. There's much less of that about Jews in diaspora. I mean, we talk about it definitely on the podcast, but it isn't sort of measured in that kind of intense way. And I just wonder, as a leader of people, as a leader of a congregation who's you're up close with Jews all the time in New York City, what's your sense of what it's been like? You've touched on it a bit with those talking about those family arguments, which I'm very struck by, but what it's been like to be a diaspora Jew these last 12 months.
It's been very challenging, and yet there have been some enormous, powerful aspects where, in some ways, people have never felt more Jewish. I just take a step back and say that a year ago on Rosh Hashanah last year, in the midst and the height of what we thought was, a civil war in Israel, like with judicial reform, I, we I then worried for the existential state of Israel. Like, little did I know what was coming, of course. But I gave a sermon in which I talked about um, whether or not this Jewish community, which not to dismiss British Jewry in any way, but to say that essentially almost half of the world's Jews live in America and the other half lives in Israel, 7 million, 7 million, and then a million everywhere else. So, Jonathan, you were part of the million diaspora, but in some ways, I almost think of us as a two-headed being, like conjoined twins, right, in some way. And there's a story in the Talmud about a person, rabbis who see conjoined twins, two-headed, one-body person. And of course, the rabbis ask a very critical question. Do they have to wrap two sets of tefillin or just one? Okay, that's what the rabbis care about. But they're really asking a deeper question, which is this one being or two beings? And I asked this question, and their response, the way they answer the question, is they say, pour boiling hot water on one head, and if the other head screams in pain, then you know it's actually one soul. Now, that's kind of a terrifying story. I shared that story in the midst of judicial reform, asking my Jewish community, are you feeling the pain of your Israeli brothers and sisters right now in the other head of the Jewish body? And I have to tell you, I wasn't sure that they were. They were paying attention, they were listening, and I think many of them cared, but they weren't feeling it in their gut. I don't think they felt the pain. Well, who could have possibly imagined that a few weeks later, October 7th happened? And then I will tell you, in the most visceral, gut, kishka way, our community felt that pain. And while it was terrifying and so brutal, and we were despairing and all these feelings, there was also something deep that happened where people were reminded, wait a minute, we are one people. We are one soul. We're sharing a common destiny in some way, even though we're across the world from each other. That was a beautiful thing that happened in our community that I did not expect. And it didn't happen because I gave some brilliant sermon either. They were like, Rabbi, you didn't convince me on Rosh Hashanah. But October 7th helped them deeply appreciate that. So I would say the vast majority of my community woke up not just to their relationship with Israel, but to even their relationship with their Judaism. A lot of October 8th Jews, I'd say, in my community that kind of discovered something new in that time. Now, I do not want to say, though, that there aren't people in the community who this experience distanced them from Judaism even more. And they felt that the war was not justified to the extent that it came. There's just a lot of pain around it. And you saw that there was, as you know, probably you've heard, generational divides where there's definitely a different feeling among people who are 30 or under. And I think a big piece of that is not just that generation, but the news that they're consuming and how they're consuming it and the stories that they're seeing. And so I did see families that were broken up over this, who couldn't have a Passover Seder together, who have not been speaking to each other, who it's extremely painful. The ones who are the most angry and yelling at each other, it's kind of like the answer I just gave you earlier. I'm actually more optimistic that they're going to come through it because they're still in it. The ones where they've walked away, that's where I'm very worried for them. I do not think that is a majority of the Jewish community, and I think those stories get told more because they pique our interest. I think the vast majority of American Jews have never felt as close to each other, to community, to their Judaism, and to Israel as they do right now.
Obviously, the community itself was going. Something was happening to the American community as well. I mean, right. When I think back on the year and look at it, I think there's one heartbreak, which was October 7th, and the other heartbreak was this, wave or tsunami of anti-Semitism sort of hitting the United States and Europe. How did you deal with that? How did the congregation deal with it? I imagine it was as big a surprise as October 7th was the magnitude of it.
We've been seeing this coming, but I gave a sermon about rising anti-Semitism 5 years ago. At that point, it was right before Pittsburgh. I had some congregants say, Rabbi, why are you talking about this? This is the most important sermon you're giving, and you're giving about anti-Semitism? Like, that's just that, we're done with this. And that was just 5 years ago. So, I think that it still completely took me by surprise. Even though I was seeing things build, I think it was the extent of it. I think it was institutions, cultural institutions, universities, arts organizations, media even, where we actually felt that these are our people. It was one thing when people were anti-Semitic and we felt like they were on maybe the other side of our political or cultural spectrum, but these were now our friends and allies. And that, I think, was what was particularly shocking, and how much it's just become normalized to just be able to do things like, I won't sit on a panel with you because you're a Zionist, or we're going to cancel your talk because you're a Zionist, or you're not allowed to walk past this barrier on our campus because you're a Zionist. That is a level of normalization of anti-Semitism that I have never experienced in my lifetime, that I did not think could happen in America. So yes, that's been frightening. The response from my community has been varied. I have people in my community, some people in positions of tremendous influence and power who've done very strong arm tactics, very public letters to their universities, withholding of donations, getting on, podcasts and speaking about these kinds of things. I've had people who've been trying to work greater interventions, more individually. There's some who've been just running away from it and don't want to talk about it. So I think people have very different responses, don't know how to respond. My response as a rabbi, and I will continue to fight anti-Semitism. There's many, many things I've done, speaking with heads of schools, speaking with college presidents. I will do all of those things. But my main job is not to fight anti-Semitism, which I promise you, I could be the best rabbi. I will not make it go away. It is the oldest hatred that exists. So we're going to have to, in some ways, understand we cannot rid the world of anti-Semitism. So my job, and I hope every Jew feels their job, is to actually be kind of the most confident, activated, engaged Jew that they can be, and to actually just wear what it is to be a Jew and embody it in the best way possible to the world and mostly to themselves. Like we have to not cower ourselves to that anti-Semitism. I think that's the biggest danger.
And just because there are some people who listen to this who may be coming to all of this a bit new, just explain to that listener why being told you're not welcome in this place because you're a Zionist is to you anti-Semitism. I'm not skeptical on that, but I think might be listeners who will benefit from you explaining that.
So Zionism has been co-opted and turned into essentially a curse word. It's the equivalent of a racist. And, Zionism is a very broad term and movement that encompasses, yes, people from, the Zionists of America and a Sheldon Adelson view to, very sort of secular sort of nationhood folks. And I mean, it's a very broad term. And the fact is that every study has shown that the vast majority of Americans call them Zionists, themselves Zionists, even though that means a lot of different things to people. But essentially, when you say we don't allow Zionists, essentially you're saying 80-90% of the Jewish community is not welcome here. So I think that people don't understand. I'm not saying that everything that is anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic, but when you've essentially precluded someone who might call themselves a Zionist from being in a space, you are precluding the vast majority of the American Jewish community. And it happened. People will say, no, we love Jews, but they're talking about what they consider good Jews, who are this tiny percentage who will completely condemn Israel and say that it doesn't have a right to exist and all of that, and live up to what they think anti-Zionists are supposed to be. So that's the difference.
Yeah, that was just a detail, a sort of footnote to the point I was going to get to, which is we've talked about America and diaspora. Just a very, in a way, local point about New York City. I mean, people mythologize that Jews, certainly in the smaller diaspora communities like mine, as being, perhaps the most comfortable place to be Jewish outside Israel would be New York City. And yet we did watch the Columbia campus protests, the protests in a way just outside Columbia, where some extraordinary things were chanted about, pro-Hamas slogans and so on. I'm just wondering what that's like for New York Jews who felt they were in the kind of nirvana for Jews, what that experience has been.
I think it's been shocking for us. I agree. I still think that New York is a nirvana for Jews, but it feels very different. My son was studying at a yeshiva in New York this summer. He's a Reform Jew. He's not generally someone who walks around with a kippah, but actually the yeshiva required him to be ritually observant for the duration of the program, including wearing kippah. And for the first time, I was nervous about my son walking around and going on subway with his kippah on. And that's in New York City. That's a very strange feeling to have. And, I'm not visibly Jewish for most people. They don't look at me and think I'm a Jew. But I've started to wear this Magen David just because I actually want to actively pronounce my Judaism in a way that might not be evident by my face. And so it's been interesting what's happened because on the one hand, there is more fear, there's more anxiety, and yet there is this kind of defiant, we are going to be here and we're going to have our presence known. And I also see something beautiful that's happening in the New York Jewish community, which in some ways it took a little bit of a tragedy to get us fully there, which is I am seeing a unity of the wider New York Jewish community that I've never seen before. I'll just share one story that you will love, which is that UJA sponsored a rabbi's mission very soon after October 7th, and about 25 of us from all different denominations, Reform to Orthodox rabbis, all traveled together to Israel. And it was a devastating time, and we all really bonded and got to know each other. And there were several rabbis who have synagogues within 10 blocks of me who I'd never met before. Okay, which is embarrassing, but that is how the New York Jewish community works in the past. After this trip, I had many, many new relationships, including with this Orthodox rabbi who's on the West Side, who I really, really admired and respected, and I believe he felt the same about me. And we really developed a friendship. And in the summer, he was hosting Naftali Bennett at his synagogue. And he wrote me and he said, I have this VIP reception. I really want you to come and be here when Naftali Bennett comes. And I thought to myself, if my Orthodox colleague wants a female Reform rabbi to show up for Naftali Bennett for this VIP reception, I'm going to be there. And so, and I come. And he introduces me with the greatest respect. We talk about our friendship. We talk about what we've done together for Israel. And Naftali Bennett, his jaw is kind of on the floor. And interestingly, when he starts his talk to these 500 Orthodox Jews in the Jewish Center, he said, I met Rabbi Buchdahl, and she's friends with Rabbi Yossi Levine, and they have this great relationship. And he said, this is what Israel needs to learn from American Jews. And it's actually really true. And this is not just window dressing. We are doing a community-wide October 7th commemoration together across the spectrum, Orthodox Jews to Reform Jews. It's sold out. We're in an overflow space at Temple Emmanuel. I don't know that would have happened in the past. We are coming together across all our differences in a way that the New York Jewish community hasn't before. So there's one of the silver linings.
That's a lot. I mean, if
it is, it is.
Jews can make peace, I think that means a lot. But I guess that connects to what I wanted to ask you. You said, we should be proud of who we are and not hide and, we began our conversation with talking about how, Jews have always known how to be joyful, even in the most terrible times. It's obviously not relevant only to this year. It's relevant to
all
forever.
Our history.
And so maybe it's important for us to remember what else we can do and how we can do it that isn't just, laughing in the face of danger. What else can we be? Who else are we? That sets us apart from everyone else. But maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
I mean, I think that we do have to properly grieve the things that have been very difficult. And that includes that we're going to make space for memory. Jews are a people of memory. We'll continue to do that we don't forget what happened here, that we don't forget the people that we lost. So we will do that. And in some ways, that proximity to death is not to leave us in that dark place, but that proximity is to actually bring us back to life and to kind of crack our hearts open and to help us actually empathize and connect with all others. I think one of the things that we forgot in some ways as American Jews, and I think Israelis also forgot it, is that the existential state of the Jew is to have nefesh hager, to have the soul of a stranger. Because, even from the very first Jew, from Abraham, he wasn't actually allowed to begin Judaism from his home, from his birthplace, from his native land. He actually has to cross over. And it's that crossing over that makes him an Ivri, like Ya'avor. He is a boundary crosser. And when he crosses over, that's when we become Hebrews, when we actually feel like we're a stranger. And that has been the Jewish story for 2,000 years while we were a diaspora people. But in some ways, once we had our land again in Israel, and once American Jews felt as comfortable as we felt here, we stopped in some ways remembering what it was like to be a stranger. And now nobody likes feeling like the stranger, but I would posit that it was in this time of feeling like the stranger, the Jews developed our sense of, creativity. We had to figure out a way to do things differently or a different route than others did. Our compassion and empathy for those who have been most vulnerable and oppressed. It is where we developed our grit in many ways and our cohesion as a community. So in so many ways, who we are as a people was forged in a place of feeling a little bit like we were on the outside. And maybe what this moment does is remind us of what that feeling was. And it's not to make us feel like isolated and outsiders. What it's supposed to make us feel is both bonded with our own tribe, but also to remember that means we reach out and empathize and we build bridges. This is what Jews have done throughout history. So I actually think there's an opportunity to connect with the essence of what it is to be a Jew in the world. And that is an opportunity for us. And to be a light, of course.
I mean, in a way, you've partly done what I was going to nudge you towards, which is we always like to wind up these conversations with something optimistic and hopeful. In a way, you've done that, but you can get, I think you know where I'm going to go with this. I would like to push my
I
luck
don't know.
tremendously because Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is a time of beautiful music in the synagogue. And I think there are so many melodies associated with Rosh Hashanah that it would be a very lovely thing for us if you could give us a flavor of one of those. I'm pushing my luck, I know this, but I'm doing it on behalf of our listener.
You never give me forewarning this is happening. I guess I should have known. Okay, but I actually think that it is the season of return, and I think there is something deeply beautiful about the idea that we can return to each other, that we can return to our deepest, best selves, that we can return maybe to God even. Imagine that. And so that prayer, we ask God to renew our days as of old. I think that's the meaning of Hashivenu, and I thought we could end with that if you'd like.
We would like.
Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Chadesh, Chadesh, Yameinu Kekedem.
Rabbi Angela Buchdahl, you've done it again. Thank you so much for coming on Unholy.
Thank you so much.
It was great to be with you.
Now, we've mentioned 2 or 3 times, you and me, Yonit, that we are doing our best heroically to find little points of light in amongst the gloom of this last year. Hopeful stories of people who, despite everything, do manage to retain some, optimism for the future and indeed for where they find themselves in their own lives. And we have a story here, I think, that just reflects that, and it feels very timely as we go into New Year and, of course, as we approach the anniversary of October the 7th.
We turn our attention now to David Gutman. David is originally from Long Island. He is 34, and he lives today in Givatayim. He made Aliyah, and this date is important, October 1st, 2023. David, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
There's so many questions, but this definitely, I assume, is not the way you expected your first year to look like. I assume you were also told before that Israelis, we're a lot of drama, but this was quite extended. So, first of all, tell me a little bit about how are you doing today?
I think that's a tough question. I think being here, every day you wake up, you don't really know what to expect, and you have to go about your life as best you can. So that means getting up and going to school, and for now going to work, and really showing up for your responsibilities, regardless of your anxieties of what you might anticipate happening throughout the day. And I'd say that the day-to-day activities, the routine, really helps you keep your mind off of things to an extent. And so it's complicated, but there's a lot of distractions in the day-to-day.
So It's Complicated could be the slogan for our podcast for Life in Israel, for the whole thing. But it is 1 year, as we are speaking, it's exactly a year since you moved. It's within a week that this horrific series of events happens. Just tell me, did members of your family get on the phone and go, okay, we get why you wanted to go,
just come back and then we'll talk about it. We can talk it through. But obviously, it makes no sense for you to be there right now. Come home. Did that happen? Not that I'm projecting how I imagine it would work in some other families I couldn't think of, but and did it go across your mind that I've just got the timing wrong? I need to go back and do this another time in my life.
My family has been super supportive. My parents never asked me to come back. I think that they were very proud to have me here throughout everything that was going on and is going on. So that might be unique to my experience, but my parents are very Zionist, and they never once said come home. They never suggested it. If I had said I want to come home, they would have supported it. But from my end, I felt I need to be here to go through this with Israelis, and my parents, I believe, felt the same way. And one of my brothers did suggest that I come home, but for the most part, my family did not communicate that sort of message, which I think may have been unique for me compared to other Olim, but yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your background. Why make Aliyah? Your mother lived here for a few years. Tell us a little bit about that decision before October 7th, obviously.
Yeah, I think, I grew up on Long Island in a very Jewish area and had a lot of Jewish culture surrounding me as a child. And then I ended up going to boarding school, and I was one of the only Jews, and I really lost my connection to Judaism. So a lot of my 20s were searching for a reconnection to that Jewish identity. And I found that in the philanthropic space in New York through the Jewish Federation. And I realized that we spent so much time sitting around conference rooms in Manhattan talking about Israel and discussing the politics here and the situation and the demographics. And at a certain point, I was just exhausted by it. And I felt that everything that we could say had been said. And I felt that I needed to be here to start, that next step of exploration to my Jewish identity and my connection to Israel and Judaism. But yeah, I grew up in a very Zionist home. My mom brought back with her all of her, Israeli art. My whole house was filled with Israeli paintings and posters. And so I was always surrounded by it. But I think until you're living here, you can't really understand or begin to understand what's going on here.
And once you did get there, you would have obviously arrived with a whole lot of expectations, and a lot of people will recognize the kind of upbringing you described. The Israel from a distance, where there's paintings on the wall and that kind of thing. Once you're there, I think even the most patriotic Israeli would not pretend the last year has been the easiest sell of life in Israel. It's been a tough year. How has the reality measured up against in some ways, the sort of ideal that you had in your mind, that was incubating before you actually got on the plane and headed there?
I think that I came into this knowing that there's an element of instability in the region. So I didn't expect 6 days in for, the biggest conflict in Israeli history, perhaps, to erupt. But I knew something could happen. I wasn't so prepared for it 6 days in, but I'd say that I don't have anything to compare this to. So on October 7th, I didn't really fully understand what was going on. I was with Israelis. The news was on in Hebrew, so I couldn't really understand. I understood that the country had been infiltrated, that the border wall had been breached, that, I understood on the basic level what was happening, but I wasn't processing it. I think, from Israelis that I've spoken to, they say the same thing. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't understand what was going on, but they could understand this was bigger than other things that had happened in the past. And for me, it was my first experience of living in war. And so I think it took me a while to process. I'm still processing it. And I'd say that, I knew rocket sirens go off, you go to the shelter. So that's really just what I was just kind of going through the motions.
I mean, obviously, as you say, you don't have something to compare to. I mean, you never lived here before. You obviously visited, but you never lived here before. Can I ask you, like a year on, what you like about the place? It's been a tough year, but...
I'd say what I find most amazing about living here is the people. Their ability to live in the moment, to enjoy the small things, just playing sheshbesh, going out to lunch with your friends. You walk away from a lunch that in the U.S. you're like, all right, we had lunch, great, on to the next thing. Here, I feel is you go to lunch with Israelis and you get up to leave and they say, wow, that was so fun, we had the best time, and you really appreciate the moments that you have together. And you also there's a greater sense of urgency in what I've observed, that to get things done, because you don't know what will happen in 2 hours, in 2 days. I was just studying a master's at Tel Aviv University, and the last 2 days I was finishing up my final project, and I didn't procrastinate because I was thinking the sirens could go off in a half an hour, in an hour, and I need to get this project done because I might not have the opportunity to work on it later on today. So that's, you're really valuing your time, and you're valuing your relationships, at least for me, in a greater sense here than I was in the U.S. I think in the U.S. you can take things for granted that here you don't.
I think you may have just put your finger on a key part of the Israeli character, and you've only been there a year, but you've identified something very important there. We wish you huge luck with your integration and future in Israel. It is a remarkable story. The man who immigrated to Israel 6 days before October 7th and stayed. David Gutman, thanks so much for telling us your story on Unholy.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. So, making Aliyah 6 days before October 7th. Yeah, something like arriving in New York 6 days before 9/11, right? But I think you understand something, David, about us. As you said, no procrastination. Things have a stronger significance. In any case, I think that leads us to us thinking about our Mention or Chutzpah Awards. We should say it will be our last award giving, particularly chutzpah, because we've made it something of a tradition not to dole out chutzpah awards on the Yom Kippur episode. So this will be our last of this Jewish year. And if I may, I would want to give it in the spirit of most of our conversation here about the North, and that the North remembers, we will give this award to UNIFIL, which is the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, which is supposed to oversee the fact that Resolution 1701 was implemented. Of course, Hezbollah violated that. And now Israel needs to, do the work and to make sure that Hezbollah moves away from the border and is not threatening Israelis as it has been for the last 11 months. And UNIFIL is quite upset about that, which seems to me a bit of chutzpah, saying we didn't do our jobs, others are coming to clean up, now we're angry. So if I may, I would want to give them the chutzpah award of this week.
Yeah, and 1701, the UN resolution, which should have kept Hezbollah behind the Litani River, and instead they're right up there by the border, where for years and years and years they have been raining fire on those Israeli communities that have been empty, really, for the last 11 months. So that's our chutzpah nomination and award. Our Mensch Award. So a little mention to former President Jimmy Carter becoming the oldest surviving American president. No president has ever reached the age of 100 before. Jimmy Carter becomes the first. I just think he gets a mention simply for this one thing, which is he said he was going to hospice care nearly 2 years ago. And everyone, including his own family, thought he would be alive for a few more days. And here he still is, marking his 100th birthday. But the main mention award I wanted to mention, journalistic colleague Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, opinion columnist for them. He is currently reporting and has been doing this, covering the story over going back many years, but he's currently reporting from the Chad-Sudan border, reporting on the horrible civil war that is going on there, which has left tens of thousands dead and millions displaced. He's been going directly interviewing victims of particularly a descendant group of the notorious Janjaweed called the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, who are driving out black Africans from Darfur and engaged in just, as he describes, house-to-house murder and rape and so on. The reason partly why I mentioned this is that the world's attention has been so, and the media's attention, has been so focused on other parts of the world, including the part of the world that we talk about every week, that it has almost let this thing go past unreported on and undiscussed. Some people say, well, yeah, horrible things go on, but they're not backed by our allies, and therefore that's why we pay so much attention to what Israel does. Actually, the RSF is armed and supported by the United Arab Emirates, Gulf state. So this is an American ally, and Nick Kristof makes the point that they get the red carpet treatment from the American administration. All I'm saying is a credit to Nick Kristof for reporting a story that doesn't get much attention, that isn't fashionable. There aren't protests on many campuses about this one, but it is a terrible, terrible and vicious war that's going on there. Credit to Nick Kristof for keeping a spotlight on it.
We can't not give the Mensch Award of the week to the fabulous Dame Maggie Smith. We have to mention this. We don't, ideally want the Mensch Award to be the obituary column, but for her, we will break all rules. I could not think today. Lenny Bruce used to say that everything in the world is either Jewish or not Jewish. So I would say that Maggie Smith in Downton Abbey is a little bit like the Jewish grandmother after finishing school. But just, she's the greatest, just the greatest. Maybe in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to tease this, we will have a conversation with someone who knew her well. That's the promo I'm going to give.
Yeah, worked with her well and knew her well. Absolutely right.
But if I may, maybe zoom out in the spirit of everything we have been saying in this episode. We're talking about Mensch Awards and giving it to individuals, and I really want to give it maybe to a group of people, because this has definitely been a year in which we discovered we have little control over our lives, particularly here. And it feels like the instinct is to say, nothing we do matters. But the truth is that the only thing that matters is what we do. And in these extreme situations, we discovered who we are and who this country is filled with. And this is a country of heroes. And, I was thinking just as we started our conversation about Eyal Eshel, whose daughter was killed in Nachal Oz, and he set up a civil inquiry because there's no commission of inquiry yet. And thinking of Lieutenant Colonel Or Ben Yehuda, who is the first female commander of the Karakal unit, taking up and fighting hundreds of terrorists in the Sufa base with only 12 soldiers. And thinking of people like Rachel Goldberg Polin fighting for her son Hirsch. And thinking of Liri and Daniela and Karina and Agam and Naama, who are the outlook soldiers of Nachal Oz and are still held by Hamas, their heroism, and the heroism of 96 other Israelis still held by Hamas. This is a country of heroes. And I think it's important to remember that this year, that there is a line that I think I quote to you every year of Naomi Shemer, the poet laureate of Israel. And it says, She'afa v'shona teheh hashana she'el matchila la'ayom. Literally, that means, may this year be beautiful and different. And figuratively, it means, may this year be a blessed improvement. So I think that is what I would want to leave us with.
I think that's a very good wish. I think we can join that with the thoughts of Rabbi Angela, who left us somehow, if not with our hearts uplifted, at least with the possibility of better and more hopeful times ahead. We will be back with you next week, just ahead of Yom Kippur. The episode will arrive Friday morning next week. But I think we have some thank yous we should offer before we say Shana Tova.
We will say our thank yous to Michal Porat. And you have a good year, Johnny Friedland. We will meet next year.
Next year, that's right. Shana Tova to you, Yonit, and to everyone listening. Happy New Year.
Shana Tova.